What if the Meghan Markle you think you know, the glamorous duchess who flashes smiles for the cameras and speaks eloquently about compassion, wasn't the same Meghan behind palace walls? What if, instead of kindness and poise, those who served her witnessed sudden explosions of temper, unpredictable outbursts, and a side of her personality the public was never meant to see? That's the claim we're diving into today, straight from the lips of a man who worked in the royal household, who lived it, who kept silent for years, until now. He's not a journalist spinning tales. He's not a distant relative speculating in tabloids. He's the butler, the one who fetched the glasses, arranged the rooms, heard the whispered arguments behind closed doors, and watched staff walk away in tears. At 47, he says he can no longer hold his tongue. He describes a Meghan Markle that was carefully hidden from view, a Meghan the cameras never captured, a Meghan who left destruction in her wake. And the details are darker than most dared to imagine. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Let's pause and ask ourselves, have we been sold an image, a glossy fairy tale of the American actress who married into royalty, while the truth was buried under palace protocol and silence agreements? The public has adored, defended, and sometimes criticized Meghan. But what we've never had, until now, was someone on the inside, someone who stood mere feet away, willing to say, this is what really happened. Think back to the first time Meghan appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace. Cameras zoomed in. Headlines called her radiant. Millions worldwide admired her poise. But behind the smile, the butler claims, there were staff trembling, already scarred by the temper tantrums no one dared to expose. Could it be that the woman who seemed to embody grace was already battling her staff behind the scenes? And if so, what does that say about the entire image carefully sold to the world? The butler's story begins quietly. He describes Meghan's arrival not as a dramatic thunderstorm, but as a sunny day that slowly, ominously darkened. At first, she was charming, even disarming. She knew names. She looked people in the eye. She thanked staff. But then, the cracks. The unpredictable eruptions. One moment, calm and collected. The next, explosive. The shift was so sudden, staff whispered that it felt like living next to a ticking time bomb. One misstep, a glass placed half an inch wrong, a meal delivered a minute late, and the mask slipped. He remembers one particular evening. A formal dinner. Guests laughing, music playing, Meghan dazzling in conversation. And then, behind the doors of the service room, her voice changed. Sharp. Cutting. Do you call this polished? She snapped at a staff member, according to the butler. The words sliced through the air like knives. The guest outside had no idea. But inside, a young footman stood frozen, humiliated, barely holding back tears. Can you imagine serving someone so radiant to the public, yet feeling terror every time you stepped into her orbit? And it wasn't just once. The butler paints a picture of repeated incidents, sometimes small, sometimes volcanic. Staff came to predict the storms, bracing themselves for impact. They even developed silent signals, glances exchanged in hallways, warnings whispered as Meghan's temper brewed. This wasn't an isolated moment of stress, he insists. It was a pattern, a hidden pattern that chipped away at morale until even the most loyal staff began to question their devotion. Now, you might ask, isn't it normal for people in high-stress environments to lose their cool? Isn't a raised voice here, or they're forgivable? Perhaps. But the butler insists this wasn't about stress. This was about power. He claims Meghan seemed to relish control. The smile for the cameras was her armor, but behind that shield was a need to dominate, to remind staff who was truly in charge. She could be dazzlingly sweet in public and icy in private. The contrast was so stark, it left staff dizzy. Which Meghan would they face today? This duality became the palace's unspoken secret. To the world, Meghan was the fresh, modern duchess shaking up tradition. To those inside, she was a figure to fear, unpredictable and mercurial. The butler describes it as a double life, one Meghan for the cameras, one Meghan for the household. And the pressure of maintaining both personas created an atmosphere of unbearable tension. Staff walked on eggshells. They rehearsed interactions. They prayed for good days. The most chilling detail? According to the butler, Meghan knew exactly what she was doing. He recalls moments when, immediately after an outburst, she would compose herself, smooth her dress, and step out smiling as though nothing had happened. The transformation was instantaneous, like flipping a switch, a public mask slipping effortlessly back into place. How could anyone watching from the outside suspect the chaos that had unfolded just seconds before? But let's go deeper. Why does this matter now? Because we live in an age where image is everything. Meghan built a brand, compassion, empathy, advocacy. And yet, if the butler's claims are true, that brand was at odds with her private reality. This is not just about one duchess losing her temper. It's about truth versus illusion. It's about the cost of silence when staff are too afraid to speak. And it's about the palace's role in covering up the cracks to protect the crown. The butler admits he was complicit. He polished the silver. He carried trays. He swallowed the truth. But at 47, he says he can no longer bear the weight of secrets. Why now? He hints that the world deserves to know, especially as Meghan and Harry continue to shape their narrative on global stages. If they speak their truths, shouldn't those who live the other side also have the right to be heard? And so, his testimony cuts deep. He doesn't just describe Meghan's temper. He describes its impact. Staff leaving in tears. Careers shattered. Rooms filled with tension. He says the palace became a place of dread rather than pride. Imagine serving in one of the world's most prestigious households and dreading every step, wondering if the next mistake, no matter how small, would unleash another storm. The irony is stark. Meghan spoke often about kindness, about compassion, about lifting others up. Yet, according to the butler, those closest to her felt crushed. The contradiction is glaring, and it leaves us with a haunting question. Who was Meghan Markle, really? The woman who inspired millions, or the woman who terrified her staff? The butler leaves us with a hint, a detail he promises will change everything we thought we knew. He describes one night, one moment, when Meghan's temper erupted in a way so shocking, even palace insiders couldn't believe it. He says it was the night when the mask slipped completely, when Meghan's private fury and public image collided in a way that left scars the palace still carries. And that's where we begin this story. Because if you thought the whispers were exaggerated, if you thought the staff complaints were petty, the butler insists you haven't heard the worst of it. Not yet. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. He remembers the first time he saw her. The anticipation had been building for weeks inside the palace walls. An American actress, glamorous and outspoken, stepping into a world that was centuries old, stiff with tradition, and guarded by protocol. Staff whispered in the corridors, speculating about what she would be like. Would she be approachable? Cold? Would she fit in? When Meghan Markle walked in, the butler recalls, she radiated warmth. She smiled at everyone she passed, shook hands, asked names. For a moment, the entire staff exhaled. Here was someone different, someone modern, someone who seemed genuinely interested in those around her. He admits he was charmed. Everyone was. The newspapers captured the fairy tale glow, but inside, those who worked closest to her thought perhaps, just perhaps, this would be a new kind of royal story. But then the mask began to slip. It didn't happen overnight. It was subtle. A raised eyebrow when a glass wasn't perfectly polished. A sudden shift in tone when tea was poured slightly cooler than expected. At first, the butler thought it was nerves. After all, stepping into royal life is no small task. Perhaps, he reasoned, the actress was simply adjusting. But adjustment gave way to habit. And habit gave way to something far more unsettling. The first royal crack appeared during an early reception. Meghan dazzled the guests, laughing easily, her hand on Harry's arm, her eyes sparkling under the lights. But in the service corridor, the butler heard her voice change, sharp, cutting. She scolded a staff member for moving too slowly, her words so biting they left the young man red-faced and shaking. Seconds later, she swept back into the room, the very picture of grace. No guest suspected a thing. Have you ever met someone who can change in an instant? Someone who can go from charming to cruel with the flick of a switch? That's how the butler describes Meghan. One moment, she was praising a staff member for their hard work. The next, she was tearing into another for the slightest mistake. The unpredictability was worse than anger itself. Staff never knew which Meghan they would face. He remembers how the mood in the household began to shift. At first, there was excitement, working for a duchess who brought Hollywood glamour into the palace. But soon, excitement turned to tension. Staff walked a little straighter, spoke a little less, double-checked every detail, terrified of triggering an outburst. The butler says he saw the sparkle in their eyes dim as the weeks went by. The household wasn't glowing anymore. It was bracing. And he noticed something else. Meghan knew how to perform for different audiences. In front of Harry, she was affectionate and playful. In front of senior royals, she was respectful and polished. In front of staff, however, she could be commanding, even ruthless. The butler describes it as a hierarchy of masks. Which one she wore depended entirely on who was watching. The turning point for him came one afternoon during preparations for a private lunch. The kitchen was busy, staff were rushing, and Meghan walked in unexpectedly. She smiled as she entered, exchanging pleasantries with Harry. But once he stepped out, her tone changed. She began pointing out flaws. Bread not sliced evenly, glasses not aligned precisely, plates arranged too close together. Her criticism wasn't calm or constructive. It was rapid, relentless, like a storm rolling in without warning. By the time she left, one staff member was visibly shaking. The butler recalls picking up a knife and noticing his own hands trembling, not from the work, but from the atmosphere she created. But perhaps the most telling moment was how she switched back. Not even a minute later, Harry re-entered the room, and Meghan's smile returned instantly. She praised the staff for their hard work, as if nothing had happened. It was seamless, almost rehearsed. The butler stood there, stunned. Could someone truly turn their personality on and off so easily? Or was this part of her nature, honed from years in front of cameras? The whispers started soon after. Staff began to compare stories in hushed voices. Did she snap at you too? Was she harsh last night? They weren't exaggerations or gossip. They were confessions, shared quietly among those who felt the same pressure. The butler admits he joined in. He, too, needed to unburden himself. But the whispers never left the servants' quarters. They couldn't. Speaking too loudly meant risking everything. And here lies the contradiction that haunted him. The public adored Meghan. Newspapers splashed her smile across front pages. Interviews highlighted her compassion and charm. Yet behind the walls of one of the most powerful families in the world, staff were terrified. Can both versions of Meghan be true? Can someone embody kindness and cruelty in equal measure? The butler insists it wasn't a question of stress or adjustment anymore. It was a question of control. He describes Meghan as someone who needed to establish dominance, to remind those around her that she wasn't just an actress anymore. She was a duchess. And the quickest way to do that wasn't through kindness. It was through fear. He recalls one phrase she used often, a phrase that still makes him shudder. Do better. She would utter it coldly, firmly, whenever something displeased her. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't emotional. It was delivered with icy precision. And for staff who already worked tirelessly, who already sacrificed personal lives for palace duty, those two words cut deeper than any shouted insult. Still, the butler stayed. He stayed because service was his life, because loyalty was his creed, and because he hoped, foolishly, that things might improve. But as time went on, he realized the Meghan who first smiled at him, the Meghan who asked his name and made him believe she cared, was only one mask. The real Meghan, the one who left staff in tears, was becoming harder and harder to ignore. And the worst part? He wasn't alone in noticing. Even Harry, he believes, saw flashes of it. There were moments when Harry tried to calm her, to shield the staff, to defuse tension. But more often than not, Harry stood by her side, silent. Was it loyalty? Was it fear? Or was it love blinding him to the damage being done around him? The butler doesn't pretend to know, but he remembers the silence, the heavy silence, that followed her outbursts. A silence that said everything. Which brings us to the question, what happens when a mask slips too far? What happens when the private storms can no longer be contained behind closed doors? Because the butler insists that's exactly what happened next. One evening, one outburst, one unforgettable moment pushed the whispers into undeniable reality. And it was then, he says, that the palace truly began to fracture. But what came next would expose even more than the staff's suffering. It would reveal the dangerous collision between Meghan's private fury and her public image. And it left everyone asking, how much longer could the mask hold? She could light up a room with a smile. Cameras loved her. Crowds adored her. Headlines declared her the modern duchess. the woman who would breathe fresh air into an ancient institution. But behind that smile, the butler insists, was another Meghan entirely. A Meghan that few saw, but none who did would ever forget. He calls it the two Meghans phenomenon, the public angel and the private fury. The public angel was dazzling. She knew her angles, her tone, her presence. At charity events, she bent down to children's eye level, spoke with warmth, and held hands as though every moment mattered. She looked straight into lenses, eyes sparkling with sincerity, her words carefully chosen. Every photograph became a masterpiece, every headline a triumph. She was, in many ways, the royal family's greatest PR weapon, someone who could connect with the modern world in ways the older royals never quite managed. But the private fury was unpredictable, explosive, and, according to the butler, often terrifying. One moment, Meghan would be laughing with Harry. The next, she would turn her ire on staff for the smallest imperfection. The butler recalls it vividly. The sudden drop in temperature when she entered a room, the collective tightening of shoulders, the fear that one misplaced word or slightly crooked napkin could spark a storm. Have you ever known someone who could make or break your day with a glance? That's how the staff described her. When she was in her public angel mood, even behind closed doors, life was manageable, pleasant even. But when the private fury surfaced, the household held its breath. The contrast was staggering. The butler remembers one incident that captures it perfectly. A morning engagement at a children's hospital. Meghan was radiant, crouching down to chat with young patients, her face full of empathy, her hands gentle. Cameras flashed. The nation swooned. But when she returned to the palace, still wearing that same designer coat, something shifted. She walked into the private quarters, noticed the tea tray hadn't been set to her liking, and snapped. The words she used, the butler says, were so sharp they reduced a young maid to tears. Within minutes, Meghan composed herself again, heading out to a meeting as if nothing had happened. The contrast left the room stunned. How could one person shift so quickly from angelic to icy? And it wasn't only the butler who noticed. Other staff whispered about it constantly. They spoke of the mood swings, of the way she seemed to thrive on control. Some even joked darkly that the palace needed a weather forecast. Sunshine when Meghan smiled, thunderstorms when she snapped. But it wasn't a joke to those who bore the brunt of her anger. For them, it was real, exhausting, and sometimes humiliating. The butler emphasizes something chilling. Meghan's fury wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was cold, calculated. A look, a phrase, delivered with such precision it could cut deeper than a shouted insult. "Do you call this acceptable?" she once asked a footman, holding up a glass she deemed imperfect. The footman, red-faced, nodded nervously, knowing there was no right answer. Moments later, Meghan walked away smiling, leaving the young man crushed. But perhaps the most unsettling part was how intentional it all seemed. The butler swears Meghan knew how to control the performance. She understood when to turn on the charm, when to unleash the fury, and when to hide both. To the outside world, there was only one Meghan, the angel. To the staff, there was another, one they called the fury. And Harry? He was always there. The butler says Harry often looked torn. Sometimes he would gently place a hand on Meghan's arm, trying to diffuse her tension. Other times, he would stay silent, watching as staff took the blows. Did he agree with her? Did he fear contradicting her? Or did he, perhaps, not even notice the full impact? The butler doesn't claim to know, but he remembers Harry's silence most of all. Silence that felt like permission. The contrast between the angel and the fury grew sharper as time went on. Meghan's public appearances became more dazzling, her popularity soaring. Yet behind the palace walls, staff turnover began to rise. One by one, members of the household resigned. Officially, they cited personal reasons or new opportunities. Unofficially, the butler says, they simply couldn't handle the private fury anymore. The butler shares one story of a longtime housekeeper, loyal to the crown for decades, who broke down after a confrontation with Meghan. She cried in the service quarters, he recalls. I'd never seen her cry before. The housekeeper left within weeks, her departure barely noted by the press. But inside the palace, it was another sign that the fury was taking its toll. And yet, the illusion held. To the outside world, Meghan was still the angel. Smiling, compassionate, eloquent. The palace played along, protecting the image, shielding the truth. The butler admits he was part of that protection. He polished the silver for banquets, poured the wine for guests, bowed at the right moments, all while knowing what happened behind the scenes. But here's the question. How long can two faces exist before they collide? How long can the angel and the fury stay separate before the truth slips through? The butler insists it happened sooner than anyone expected. One night, the fury burst forth in a way that even the palace couldn't entirely conceal. And it was that moment, he says, that marked the beginning of the end of the illusion. The public adored Meghan. The staff feared her. And the palace, caught in the middle, began to crack. But the butler warns, if you think the public angel versus private fury was shocking, wait until you hear what happened on the night when staff, multiple staff, were left in tears. A night that became legendary in whispers and a turning point in silence. And it is that night, the night of tears, that would reveal just how deep the fury ran. They still whisper about it in the servants' quarters. They call it the night of tears. It began like any other evening, with the palace humming in its usual rhythm. A formal dinner was scheduled. Guests were important, timing precise, details flawless. For the staff, this was nothing new. They had served state banquets, royal weddings, and private suppers where one wrong fork placement could invite icy glares from the highest in the land. But this night was different, not because of who sat at the table, but because of what unfolded behind closed doors. The butler remembers the tension rising long before Meghan even entered the room. The staff were nervous. They had already learned that she could turn an ordinary evening into a battlefield. Every glass was polished thrice, every dish rehearsed. Yet, no amount of preparation could protect them from what was about to happen. It began with something small, something so minor, most would have brushed it off. A napkin folded incorrectly. A dish served slightly cooler than expected. The butler doesn't even remember which came first, only that Meghan noticed, and once she noticed, the storm began. Her smile slipped, her tone sharpened, and suddenly the room was suffocating. "You call this service?" she snapped at one young staff member. Her voice wasn't raised to a shout, but it was sharp enough to cut through the air. The footman, barely in his 20s, froze. His hands trembled as he tried to correct the mistake. But Meghan wasn't done. One criticism turned into another. One target became two, then three. The butler recalls the sound most vividly, not of shouting, but of quiet sobs muffled in corners as staff tried to carry on with their duties while holding back tears. The young maid who was told she was incompetent. The server who was scolded for being too slow. The footman who dropped a spoon because his hands were shaking, only to be met with icy disdain. By the time the main course was served, the atmosphere in the service corridor was unbearable. One after another, staff slipped into the pantry, tears running down their faces, whispering to each other in disbelief. Never, in all their years of service, had they felt so humiliated. And the butler? He stood there, helpless, torn between his duty and his conscience. He had served demanding royals before. He had endured stern words, icy silences, even the occasional outburst. But this was different. This wasn't the stern discipline of a monarch or the high standards of tradition. This was personal. It felt, he says, like cruelty for cruelty's sake. Have you ever been in a room where you could almost taste the tension? Where the air felt heavy, pressing down on your chest, making it hard to breathe? That's how he describes the night of tears. The strangest part, he insists, was how quickly Meghan could flip the switch. Minutes after berating staff, she would glide into the dining room, her smile radiant, her laugh effortless. Guests would gush about her warmth, never suspecting that only a few feet away, staff were swallowing sobs, their cheeks still wet. The contrast was dizzying. The butler says it was like watching an actress on stage, except this wasn't a performance for cameras. This was her life, and theirs. But the night wasn't over. The breaking point came when one senior staff member, a woman who had served the royal household for years, finally cracked. She had been berated for a trivial mistake, a bottle of wine opened too late, or perhaps the angle of a candle. The detail is blurry. What isn't blurry is the sight of her excusing herself, rushing into the corridor, and breaking down completely. This was no inexperienced maid. This was a seasoned professional who had endured decades of service with grace. And now, she was weeping uncontrollably, unable to compose herself. The butler followed her into the corridor, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. She shook her head, tears streaming, whispering, "I can't do this anymore." He knew, in that moment, something had shifted. This wasn't just a difficult evening. This was a fracture in the very foundation of palace service. And yet, no one could speak up. Silence was the rule. Silence protected the crown. Silence protected Meghan's image. So the staff wiped their tears, straightened their uniforms, and carried on. To the guests, the dinner was flawless. To the world, Meghan remained radiant. But in the shadows, in the places cameras never reached, the night of tears left scars that would never fade. The butler admits he questioned himself that night. Why stay? Why endure? Was loyalty to the crown worth this quiet suffering? But he also knew the cost of speaking out. Contracts, confidentiality, reputation. He swallowed his doubts, polished another glass, and carried on. But deep down, he knew he had witnessed something that could not be forgotten. What makes the story even more haunting is how the staff began to speak of it afterward. Whispered conversations in corridors, nervous jokes that weren't funny, a shared understanding that they had all lived through something that went beyond the usual stresses of palace service. They had lived through the fury in full force. The butler calls it the night of tears not just because staff cried, but because something else broke that night. Trust. Trust that service was honorable. Trust that they were part of something bigger than themselves. Trust that dignity could withstand cruelty. It was gone, replaced by fear. And the palace? It did what it always did. It covered. It smoothed. It smiled for the cameras. The butler says that's what made it even worse, the pretense. Watching Meghan charm the world while knowing what had happened only hours before. Watching the headlines gush about her compassion while remembering the tears that stained the pantry floor. The hypocrisy gnawed at him. But he stayed silent. They all did. Until now. And here's where the story takes a darker turn. Because according to the butler, the night of tears wasn't an isolated event. It was the beginning of a pattern. One that would tighten Meghan's grip on the household, enforce her unspoken rules, and push staff further toward breaking point. He says it was after this night that the staff truly understood. There were rules in Meghan's palace, and breaking them meant suffering the consequences. But what were those rules? And how far was she willing to go to enforce them? There are rules in every royal household. Rules about how to bow, how to serve, how to address members of the family. For centuries, they've been written and unwritten, passed down from one butler to the next, from one maid to her replacement. But according to the butler, Meghan brought in her own rules, ones that didn't come from tradition, but from her. And they weren't suggestions. They were commands. He calls them Meghan's palace rules. And while they were never written on paper, they became as binding as any decree. Staff knew them. They feared them. And they followed them, because breaking them meant facing her temper. The first rule was silence. Staff were to be invisible. No chatter. No personal stories. No conversation unless directly addressed. Meghan expected absolute focus. And if anyone dared to speak too casually or share something personal in her presence, her eyes would sharpen and her smile would vanish. The butler remembers a young maid mentioning, innocently, how much she admired one of Meghan's outfits. Meghan's response was cold, clipped. "That's not your concern." The maid never spoke in her presence again. The second rule was perfection. Nothing less. Every detail mattered. Cutlery aligned, glasses spotless, cushions fluffed, flowers arranged to her exact liking. It wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about control. The butler says she often walked into rooms and scanned them like a director inspecting a set. If something was off, even slightly, she would point it out with laser precision. Once, she demanded a table be reset because the knives were angled incorrectly by mere millimeters. It wasn't about the knives. It was about showing she was in charge. The third rule was loyalty. Absolute, unquestioning loyalty. Staff were expected to prioritize her needs above all else. Shifts stretched longer. Breaks were shortened. Vacations canceled. One maid, who had been promised time off to visit her family, was suddenly told she couldn't go because Meghan needed her. The maid cried quietly in the kitchen, but she stayed. Refusal wasn't an option. Loyalty was mandatory. And then came the fourth rule, deference. Meghan wanted to be addressed formally, even in private settings. No casual ma'am, no relaxed familiarity. She expected a level of respect usually reserved for senior royals. It was as though she wanted to remind us, constantly, of her position, the butler explains. For centuries, staff had treated royals with formality, but Meghan took it further. She demanded it at every moment, in every room, no exceptions. The butler remembers one chilling moment that drove this home. A staff member forgot to address her properly, stumbling over words in a flustered moment. Meghan stopped, stared, and delivered a phrase that froze the room. "Remember who you're speaking to." Her tone was calm, but her meaning was unmistakable. The staff member never made the mistake again. These rules spread through the household like wildfire. New hires were warned discreetly. Don't speak unless spoken to, don't miss a detail, don't forget her title. They weren't in any handbook. They didn't need to be. They were enforced through fear. Break them, and you would face her fury. The butler says it created an atmosphere unlike any he had experienced in decades of service. In other royal households, rules existed, yes, but they came with a sense of tradition, of dignity. You knew why they were there. With Meghan, it felt different. It felt personal. It felt like control for control's sake. Have you ever lived under rules that seemed designed not to guide, but to dominate? That's how the staff described Meghan's palace. Every movement, every gesture, every breath was measured against her standards. And because her standards could change without warning, staff lived in constant fear of slipping up. One evening, the butler recalls, Meghan ordered flowers for a private dinner. White roses, arranged in a specific style. The florist delivered them, and staff arranged them carefully. Meghan walked in, glanced once, and said, "No, this isn't right." The butler tried to explain that the roses matched her request exactly. Her response was icy, "I don't care. Do better." The arrangement was torn apart, redone, and redone again, until finally, she approved. Hours wasted, tempers frayed, staff exhausted. But Meghan had made her point. Only her approval mattered. Another time, Meghan demanded that an entire room be redecorated because the cushions didn't feel right. Not look right, feel right. The staff spent hours swapping them, testing fabrics, adjusting colors. And yet, she never explained what exactly was wrong. It was as if the point wasn't the cushions at all. It was to remind everyone that her word was final. The butler admits he found himself questioning reality. Was he imagining the severity? Was Meghan simply meticulous? Or was it something darker? But when he saw the toll it took on others, the tears, the resignations, the whispered complaints, he knew it wasn't just him. This was real, and it was breaking people. The most haunting part, he says, was Meghan's ability to enforce the rules with a single phrase. Staff dreaded hearing it. Do better. 2 words. Cold, final, impossible to argue with. It didn't matter how hard they worked, how much effort they gave. It was never enough. And that was the point. The rules of Meghan's palace weren't just about service. They were about power. They turned the household into a place of fear, where silence reigned, where perfection was demanded but never rewarded, where loyalty was taken for granted, and where deference was absolute. The butler says he still hears her voice in his head sometimes, sharp and commanding, cutting through years of service with a single phrase. And he remembers the way the staff looked at each other after she left a room, exhausted, drained, beaten down. The rules had taken their toll. But as harsh as those rules were, they weren't the whole story. Because Meghan's palace wasn't just about rules, it was about power struggles. Inside the walls, alliances formed. Lines were drawn. Some staff tried to appease her, others quietly resisted, and the butler began to see that Meghan wasn't just ruling the staff, she was dividing them. And when division enters a household, the consequences are always explosive. You were either with her or against her. That's how the butler describes the atmosphere that began to consume the royal household once Meghan had settled in. It wasn't just about serving meals, arranging flowers, or keeping the palace spotless anymore. It was about allegiance, about loyalty to her personally, about proving again and again that you were on her side. And in a household where dozens of staff worked shoulder to shoulder, that loyalty, or the lack of it, became a dividing line that ran deep. The butler recalls how Meghan tested people in subtle ways. Sometimes it was as small as how quickly you responded to her requests. Other times it was whether you defended her in front of others. Staff who nodded along, who praised her, who kept quiet when she snapped. Those became her allies. Staff who hesitated, who offered excuses, or who failed to meet her impossible standards. Those became her enemies. Have you ever been in a workplace where one person holds so much power they can pit people against each other without ever saying it outright? That's what happened behind palace walls. The butler says Meghan didn't need to shout, "You're either with me or against me." Her behavior made it clear. Staff quickly realized that survival depended on being in her good graces. And so, cliques formed. On one side were the allies. These were staff who bent over backwards to please her, who worked late into the night, who jumped at her every command. They defended her even when they knew she was wrong, because they understood that her favor brought protection. If Meghan liked you, she could make your life easier. She could praise you to Harry. She could shield you from criticism. Her approval was rare, but when it came, it felt like winning a prize. On the other side were the enemies, or at least those she treated as such. These were the staff who couldn't keep up with her demands, who slipped up once, who failed to anticipate her needs. The butler says it didn't matter how experienced you were or how loyal you had been to the crown for decades. One mistake could put you on Meghan's bad list, and once you were there, it was nearly impossible to recover. She would ignore you, correct you harshly, or freeze you out completely. The butler himself, though seasoned and loyal, says he often felt caught in the middle. He tried to serve with dignity, to remain professional, but he could see the way the household was fracturing. One evening, he overheard two staff members arguing in the pantry, one furious that the other hadn't backed them up when Meghan criticized them, the other snapping that it wasn't worth the risk to cross her. The argument ended in silence, the kind of silence that says friendship has been lost. And that was the true cost of Meghan's divide-and-rule style. Staff weren't just afraid of her. They began to mistrust each other. No one wanted to be the one left exposed. No one wanted to be caught on the wrong side of her temper. So they whispered less, avoided eye contact, and worked with a tension that hung heavy in the air. The butler recalls a specific incident that illustrates this division perfectly. Meghan had requested a special dinner arrangement, something unusual that required extra preparation. The team worked late into the night to get it perfect. But on the evening itself, one tiny element went wrong, a garnish missing from one plate. Meghan noticed instantly. She singled out the staff member responsible, her words sharp, her tone icy. But then, she turned to another staff member and praised them for their attention to detail. The message was clear. One was an ally, the other an enemy. That contrast, the butler says, was deliberate. It wasn't just about the garnish. It was about showing that she had favorites, that she rewarded loyalty and punished failure. And everyone watching understood the lesson. Even more unsettling, he adds, was how Meghan seemed to enjoy watching staff compete for her approval. She would praise one made lavishly in front of others, then turn around and criticize another for something minor. The effect was immediate: jealousy, rivalry, resentment. It fractured the household further, making it easier for her to stay in control. But allies didn't stay allies forever. The butler says he saw it happen many times. A staff member who had once been in her good graces suddenly fell out of favor. Sometimes it was a mistake. Sometimes it was just her mood. One day you were praised, the next you were scorned. It kept everyone on edge. Never see. And here's where the story turns darker. Because one of Meghan's closest allies, someone who had defended her tirelessly, eventually became her greatest liability. The butler hints that this person saw too much, endured too much, and in the end, could no longer stay silent. Their loyalty was tested to its breaking point, and when it snapped, it exposed cracks Meghan couldn't ignore. The butler won't say yet who it was, only that the betrayal shook the household. Meghan had built her control on loyalty and division. To lose someone from her inner circle meant the lines she had drawn weren't as strong as she believed. And the fallout from that betrayal, he says, set the stage for even bigger confrontations to come. Because if Meghan could divide staff, what happened when the divisions reached the royals themselves? What happened when her style of control clashed with the traditions and tempers of the senior family members? The butler leans forward, his voice low, almost a whisper, as he recalls it. That was when things truly turned dangerous. When it wasn't just staff crying in the corridors. It was royals slamming doors. And the night she went head-to-head with the future queen? That was a clash no one in the palace will ever forget. Behind the gilded doors of Buckingham and Kensington, protocol rules everything. Who enters a room first? Who sits where? Who speaks when? These are traditions carved out over centuries, designed to preserve dignity and prevent chaos. But according to the butler, Meghan never fully accepted these invisible boundaries. And when she clashed with senior royals, the collisions were as fiery as they were unforgettable. He calls them the showdowns. The first came quietly. A family meeting, meant to be routine. Senior royals gathered, staff hovering at the edges, ready to serve. Meghan, still new to palace life, entered the room with Harry. She smiled, charming as always, but when it came time to take her place, she hesitated. Tradition dictated that she stand slightly behind the more senior members of the family. But Meghan didn't move. She remained front and center, smiling brightly, ignoring the subtle hand gestures from staff. The butler recalls the silence. The kind of silence that feels louder than words. Senior royals exchanged glances. Meghan carried on, unfazed. Later, in the corridor, staff whispered nervously. Did she not know? One asked. She knew, the butler answered. She just didn't care. At first, it was little things like this. Protocols brushed aside, traditions ignored. But as weeks turned into months, the showdowns became more direct. Meghan didn't just bend the rules. She challenged the royals themselves. One moment stands out in the butler's memory. A formal dinner, the kind where every seat is assigned with meticulous care. Meghan, noticing her placement further down the table, frowned. She whispered something to Harry. Moments later, she asked, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Why aren't we seated closer to the Queen?" The butler felt his stomach drop. Questions like that weren't asked. Not openly. Not at the table. Harry shifted uncomfortably, trying to soothe her, but the words had already landed. The Queen, dignified as ever, didn't respond. But the frost in the air was undeniable. And then came the confrontation with Kate, the future Queen. It was during a planning session for a joint event. Meghan arrived with notes, ideas, suggestions. She spoke passionately, outlining how she believed things should be done. Kate listened, calm, composed, but when she gently explained that certain traditions couldn't be altered, Meghan's expression hardened. The butler, stationed nearby, saw the tension rise like a storm cloud. Tradition isn't always right, Meghan said firmly. Tradition is why we're here, Kate replied, equally firm. The butler swears the room froze. Staff shifted nervously, eyes darting between the two women. It wasn't just a disagreement over event details. It was a clash of philosophies. Meghan wanted change, bold and immediate. Kate wanted continuity, gradual and respectful. Neither would budge. Harry tried to interject, but Meghan pressed on, her tone sharper now. Kate remained calm, but her silence spoke volumes. When the meeting ended, Meghan left quickly, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Kate lingered, speaking softly to staff, her composure unshaken. But the damage was done. The butler describes the aftermath as a fracture that never healed. From that day on, he says, there was an unspoken tension between Meghan and senior royals. Smiles were exchanged in public, but behind closed doors, the air was thick with frost. Meghan, he claims, felt she wasn't being respected. The royals, in turn, felt she wasn't respecting them. And then came the loudest showdown of all. A heated discussion over royal duties, in which Meghan openly challenged a senior royal's decision. The butler won't reveal every word, but he remembers the raised voices, the slamming of a door, and the stunned silence that followed. "I'd never heard a royal door slam like that," he says quietly. "Not in all my years." What struck him most wasn't the argument itself, but Meghan's reaction afterward. She walked away with her head high, unfazed, as if the clash had only confirmed her position. Staff, meanwhile, whispered in disbelief. "No one speaks to them like that," one muttered. And yet Meghan had. Have you ever witnessed a clash where you knew, instantly, things could never go back to the way they were? That's how the butler describes these moments. They weren't just disagreements. They were turning points. Every showdown left deeper cracks in the palace walls. And Harry? The butler says he looked torn. He wanted to protect Meghan, but he also knew the weight of tradition. He often found himself caught in the middle, trying to calm her while avoiding open defiance of his family. The strain showed in his face, his posture, the way his laughter grew rarer in the halls. The butler insists these showdowns mark the beginning of the royal fracture we all witnessed later. The interviews, the accusations, the departures. They weren't sudden explosions. They were sparks, lit behind closed doors, long before the public ever knew. But the most unforgettable moment, he says, was the night Meghan stood toe-to-toe with Kate in private. Words were exchanged that could never be taken back. Staff nearby heard fragments, sharp, cutting, emotional. The butler won't repeat them all, but he swears the air in the corridor outside felt electric, as though the palace itself knew history was shifting. And when Meghan stormed out, her face composed but her eyes blazing, the butler realized. This wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a battle for power. Because once you challenge the future queen, the household itself begins to unravel. But the butler's story doesn't end with showdowns. Because even those who endure, who stay silent, eventually reach a breaking point. And for him, that moment came sooner than he expected. He had spent his entire adult life in service. From polishing silver until it gleamed like glass, to standing silently in corridors waiting for the signal to move. Duty was second nature. For years, he believed there was no hardship he could not endure in the name of loyalty to the crown. But everyone has a limit. And for the butler, that limit came the night he reached his breaking point. He calls it the moment he realized he was no longer serving tradition, but surviving tyranny. It was late, long past the hour most households had quieted. A private dinner had stretched on, and Meghan had returned to her quarters with Harry. Staff lingered, cleaning up, exhausted yet focused. The butler was among them, his mind moving mechanically through tasks he had performed 1,000 times before. And then, he heard her voice. Unacceptable. 2 words, cold as stone. He turned and saw Meghan holding a tray he had arranged himself. The silverware sparkled, the glasses were aligned, the cloths pressed to perfection. Yet, to her eyes, something was wrong. "What is this?" she demanded. The butler, steady as always, explained that the items had been prepared according to palace tradition. He had overseen every detail personally. Meghan listened, then narrowed her eyes. "Tradition," she repeated, as though the word itself were offensive. "Do better." Those words, he had heard them before. Staff dreaded them. But this time, something was different. She didn't just criticize the tray. She criticized him. "You've been here for years," she said quietly, her tone laced with disdain. "And this is the best you can do?" The butler froze. Never, in decades of service, had a royal spoken to him that way. Stern words, yes. High expectations, always. But this was personal. A deliberate cut, meant to wound. He felt the weight of her gaze, sharp and unyielding, pressing down on him. And for the first time in his career, he felt small. He carried the tray back to the pantry, his hands trembling. He set it down, staring at it as if the silverware might reveal the answer. Was it crooked? Was it imperfect? No, it was flawless. He knew it was flawless. And yet, her words echoed in his head. "Is this the best you can do?" It was then he realized something devastating. It wasn't about the tray. It wasn't about service. It was about control. Have you ever had a moment when you suddenly see the truth you've been avoiding? When the illusion shatters and reality becomes too sharp to ignore? That's what happened to him that night. The butler describes standing alone in the pantry, the sound of muffled laughter drifting from Megan's quarters, while he felt his chest tighten with anger and shame. He had given his life to this household. He had served faithfully, endured hardship, sacrificed personal happiness for duty. And now, he was being reduced to nothing, not by the queen, not by a prince, but by a woman who had only just entered the palace and already sought to dominate it. That night, he says, he broke. He didn't shout. He didn't slam a door. He didn't storm out. Instead, he stood still, his hands gripping the edge of the counter, and whispered to himself, "Enough." The next morning, his resolve was tested again. Megan summoned staff for an unscheduled meeting. She outlined new demands, stricter schedules, revised protocols, endless changes that ignored centuries of tradition. The staff nodded silently, afraid to contradict her. But the butler, for the first time in his life, felt no fear. He felt empty. Hollow. Her voice no longer carried the power it once had. He had already decided. His service to her was over. And then came the moment that haunts him still. As the meeting ended, Megan looked directly at him. Her eyes locked on his, as though she sensed the shift within him. She smiled faintly, not a warm smile, but one of control, and leaned close enough for only him to hear. "You'll never forget me," she whispered. The words sent a chill through him. They weren't said in jest. They weren't playful. They were a declaration, almost a threat. And he knew, in that instant, she was right. He would never forget her. Not because of admiration, but because of the scars she had left. That night, he sat alone in his quarters, the silence pressing in on him. He thought of the years he had given to the crown, the pride he had once felt in his work, the dignity of service. And then he thought of Megan's words, sharp and unforgettable. For the first time in his career, he wept. Not out of exhaustion, but out of grief for what had been lost. The butler says that was his breaking point. The moment he realized he could no longer endure. He continued his duties for a time, outwardly unchanged, but inside, he had resigned. His loyalty had cracked. His heart had turned. And that is why, years later, at 47, he chose to speak. Not out of bitterness, but out of a need to reclaim the dignity that had been stripped from him. Because once you reach your breaking point, silence is no longer possible. But his breaking point wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of his awakening. Because after that night, he began to see things differently. Not just Megan's temper, but the way staff whispered about her, the names they gave her, the reputation she had built behind palace doors, and what they called her in secret. That, he says, was even more revealing than the tears she caused. They never said it aloud when she was in the room. Never when her footsteps echoed down the marble halls or when her laughter carried from a drawing room. But in the safety of the servants' quarters, when the doors were closed and the tea was poured, they gave her a name. Not Her Royal Highness. Not the Duchess. Not even Madam. They called her something else. A nickname whispered in tones of exhaustion, frustration, sometimes even fear. The butler won't repeat the exact phrase on record. Loyalty to the palace, even now, restrains him. But he describes it as sharp, unflattering, and unforgettable. It was the kind of name staff use when they've reached their limit, he explains. When respect is gone, and all that's left is survival. He says Megan's reputation among staff was unlike anything he had ever witnessed in his decades of service. Other royals had been demanding. Others had been strict. Some even had tempers of their own. But Megan's effect was different. It wasn't just about what she did in the moment. It was about how she made people feel long after she had left the room. Drained. That's the word the butler repeats. Staff felt drained, as though every encounter with her sapped their energy, their pride, their willingness to serve. Have you ever met someone who could empty a room of joy without even raising their voice? Someone whose presence made people tighten their shoulders and measure every breath? That's how the staff described Megan. The nickname they gave her reflected that reputation. It wasn't just cruel for cruelty's sake. It captured how they saw her. Exacting, unpredictable, and impossible to please. The butler recalls overhearing one footman whisper it after a particularly harsh scolding. The word hung in the air like smoke, dangerous but undeniable. Others glanced around nervously, then nodded in agreement. Soon, the name spread quietly through the household. It became shorthand, a warning, a way to acknowledge the shared struggle without speaking too openly. "Be careful," one maid would say to another. "She's in a mood today." "No, she's in a nickname mood," the other would whisper back, and they would both understand. The butler insists it wasn't malicious gossip, it was a coping mechanism. The staff had to find some way to let off steam, some way to acknowledge the strain they were under. Without it, the tension would have been unbearable. But reputations spread quickly in palace walls. Soon, it wasn't just the lowest ranks who whispered. Even senior staff, who had served for decades, began to exchange glances, shake their heads, mutter under their breath. One evening, after Meghan had left a room in icy silence, the butler heard a senior housekeeper sigh. "God help us." That, he says, was the moment he realized her reputation had reached a point of no return. And yet, to the outside world, Meghan remained untouchable. The press called her radiant. Interviews portrayed her as compassionate. The public adored her. The butler admits it was surreal, almost disorienting, to read headlines about her kindness while staff in the palace cried quietly in pantries and stairwells. This contradiction, adored in public, feared in private, became her defining reputation among staff. The nickname was just the tip of it. Behind closed doors, they spoke of her as a storm, unpredictable and destructive. Some said working under her was like walking a tightrope in a hurricane. One wrong step, and you were finished. The butler remembers one haunting story. A maid, young and eager, had worked tirelessly to prepare a room for Meghan. Hours spent arranging flowers, folding linens, polishing every surface. Meghan walked in, glanced around, and declared it unacceptable. The maid, crushed, burst into tears the moment Meghan left. Later, in the servants' hall, she whispered the nickname through her sobs. Others gathered around, offering comfort, nodding in silent agreement. The butler says it was the first time he saw the nickname spoken with tears, and it drove home just how deeply her reputation had sunk. And here's the irony. Meghan often spoke about compassion, about kindness, about lifting others up. She gave speeches on empathy, on dignity, on humanity. Staff heard those words, saw the glowing headlines, and felt the sting of hypocrisy. "If only the world knew," one of them muttered to the butler after watching Meghan on television. "If only they saw what we see." But the world didn't see. Not then. The palace kept silent. Staff kept silent. The image was protected, and the nickname remained locked in whispers. Still, reputations have a way of seeping through cracks. Rumors began to spread beyond the palace walls. Journalists caught whispers of staff turnover. Anonymous sources hinted at tears and tension. Meghan's public image remained strong, but shadows were creeping in. And the butler knew, sooner or later, the truth would force its way out. Yet even as staff struggled with her reputation, one question haunted them all. What about Harry? Did he see it? Did he hear the whispers? Did he know the nickname? The butler insists Harry wasn't blind. He saw the tension. He noticed the resignations. He heard the muffled tears. But whether he acknowledged it, or chose to ignore it, is another matter. Some staff believed he enabled her, protecting her from criticism. Others thought he was caught in her orbit, unable to break free. Whatever the truth, the butler says Harry's role was pivotal. Because Meghan's reputation among staff might have been devastating, but it was Harry's reaction to it that determined whether the fury continued unchecked. And when he chose Meghan over tradition, over staff, even over the quiet pleas of those closest to him, the household knew. The fury was no longer just Meghan's. It was theirs to endure, sanctioned by a prince. But what exactly was Harry's role? Protector? Enabler? Or something far more complicated? Was Harry shielding Meghan from the storm? Or was he the reason the storm kept raging? That is the question the butler says haunted the household more than anything else. Because while Meghan's reputation among staff grew darker with every whispered nickname, the man by her side was not a bystander. He was her husband, her defender, her prince. And whether he realized it or not, his choices shaped everything that followed. The butler describes Harry as transformed from the moment Meghan entered his life. Before her, he was known to staff as warm, sometimes cheeky, often approachable. He laughed easily, joked with the kitchen team, sometimes even helped carry a tray if he saw someone struggling. He was the prince who felt human, the butler recalls. The one who didn't hide behind protocol. But after Meghan arrived, something shifted. Harry became more guarded, less accessible. Staff who had once shared banter with him now found him distant. His eyes seemed to search rooms constantly, always watching Meghan, always attuned to her mood. The butler swears it was as though Meghan's presence cast a shadow over him. Protective, yes, but also consuming. Have you ever known someone who changed completely once they fell in love? Who seemed to lose pa?